This afternoon, we're going to switch gears a little bit. This morning was pretty biochemistry heavy. A lot of biochemistry, I'm so sorry. And kind of nutrition focused. We're going to switch gears a little bit to hormones. No, we got a lot of really non-related topics that eventually would interrelate. So we're going to talk about urinary hormones and estrogen metabolism, and more specifically, our complete hormones profile. The objectives to this lecture, and what I hope you'll be able to do by the end of the lecture, is explain some of the symptoms of hormone imbalance and discuss different testing options. There's a lot of different ways to test hormones, and we're going to touch on that in this talk. We're also going to look at the steroidogenic pathway, and we're going to use this to really just talk about basic hormone metabolism. Yes, more pathway charts. Apparently, I'm the queen of these pathway charts. So we're going to talk about the other pathway chart that's in your packet, the steroidogenic pathway chart. We're going to review Genova's complete hormones profile. And then lastly, we're going to again talk more about SNPs, which we spoke about this morning, these single nucleotide polymorphisms. And we're going to see how they can influence estrogen detoxification, which is super important. And again, SNPs and biomarkers, by putting them together, is something Genova does a lot, and I think it really adds to the overall clinical picture. So we're going to talk about how overlaying SNPs into those results are important. So let's start basic. What are the symptoms of hormone imbalance? And to be honest, these are fairly common knowledge, right? Just about anything. Weight gain, anxiety, libido, brain fog, vaginal dryness, hair loss, hot flashes, sleep disturbances, mood swings, breast tenderness, kind of runs the gamut, right? So we have this big laundry list of all of these different symptoms that can be caused by hormonal imbalance. But in essence, it's really about finding a balance. When you do testing and you're treating a patient with hormone imbalance, it really comes down to every patient is different. A balance for one patient is a little bit different than a balance for another patient. And it's really about taking your time, looking at each patient uniquely, which is kind of what functional medicine does at its core. And hormones are one of those places where it really does come to the forefront. So we often test patients who have any of these hormone imbalances to help them find that balance. But the question always comes up, and the most common thing we get is, where do I start? I mean, there's saliva, there's blood, there's urine. How do you figure out? How do you decide which one you're going to use? Pretty common question. And it really comes down to, what do you want to know? Right? There's a lot of different ways. Each of them can tell you something different. So before you, God bless you, before you do anything, you've got to ask yourself, what am I getting at here? What's the clinical question I want to know? And then you have to understand, what are the advantages and disadvantages to each of those specimen types? And lastly, are there therapeutic modalities being used? Do you have someone on topical hormones? Do you have someone on oral hormone therapy? These are all the things that go into which specimen type you want to use. And here they are. First is serum. So you draw someone's blood, looking for testing hormones, looking for hormones. What you're looking at are both bound and unbound active hormones. Hormones travel around, usually attached to something called sex hormone binding globulin. So there are things that carry the hormones around. When you test the blood, you're going to see bound and unbound hormones. Saliva is just unbound. It's ready to be used. It's waiting to go. Not bound to anything. Different. Urine is kind of what's filtered through your blood and comes out in pee. So some people say, oh, urine is waste, right? It's waste, but it can reflect a lot of different things. Urine is very important because it's where we see how hormones are metabolized. We get to see the urinary metabolites. You can see some parent hormones, but we're not sure if that reflects endogenous or peripheral production of hormones. But we do know it's the end product of all of this hormone detoxification, and it's important to look at metabolites. So when you talk about, where do I start? It's really, what do you want to see? What are you looking for? What's the goal of the test? Which I think is a question we should ask in every test we order, and you're going to make a patient pay for it. You want to know, what's the question you're looking to answer? So the way we talk about this at Genova, And the way we explain this to patients, I have to credit one of my compadres on the Asheville branch. Metaphorically, a guy walks into a bank. And we literally say this on the phone to doctors because in our minds, this really makes sense. Blood is like asking to see all of his holdings, his IRA, his stocks, what's in the savings account, tell me everything we got. Saliva is asking, how much cash do I have? How much can I withdraw right now to use? Urine is like showing up, asking for all of his receipts and trying to figure out where he's spending his money. Yeah? So the 3 different questions being asked and answered here. And when you're trying to decide what test to use, ask yourself, what are you looking for? Yeah? I just love that metaphor. It just makes me laugh every time. And it really makes sense in my head. So we're going to focus on urine today, and we talk about that looking at the metabolites in your urine really tells you how you're detoxifying and metabolizing hormones. So let's focus here. That's kind of a gross picture, isn't it? So our urinary panel is called the complete hormones. Most of you already know this. It comes as a FMV, which is a first morning void urine test, or a 24-hour collection. When you measure someone's urine for 24 hours, the reason for that is that there are fluctuations that happen through the course of a day. And when you have someone at any type of hormone replacement therapy, depending on how they're taking it, is it topical, is it oral, depending on how they're taking it, there's wider fluctuations. Our recommendations in most patients is that if you're on any type of hormone replacement therapy, the 24-hour option really captures and mitigates all of those swings high or low and gives you that average over 24 hours, which is probably your most correct reading. In someone who's not on hormone replacement therapy, the first morning void is usually sufficient because it really does reflect about 8 hours of holding urine through the night in that first morning void. And there's not as much crazy fluctuation as when someone's taking a hormone replacement. So that's the difference between the 2 tests. And someone on hormone replacement, we recommend the 24-hour. And someone not on hormone replacement, first morning void should be fine. Sorry? For males, the same holds true. First morning void, if someone's on testosterone therapy or any other kind of hormonal therapy, 24 hours is the way to go. There are many people who aren't on any type of hormone replacement who actually opt to do the 24-hour because you're most correct. It's your most exact. If you're going to capture all of that urine for 24 hours, it's the most exact. However, we have found that the correlations are quite similar in someone who does a first morning void. Yeah? Again, you're looking in the urine, so you're seeing unbound. I'm sorry, go ahead. Such a great question. We get this a lot. And in fact, the urine, when it measures parent metabolites, doesn't measure synthetic hormones. So you won't pick up patients who are on synthetic hormones. We're talking about bioidentical hormone replacement therapy. Someone who's taking an oral contraceptive, over time, they've suppressed their body's endogenous production of those things. People still do the test because you can still see how they're metabolizing, but to look at the parent hormone levels, it won't pick those up. Steroids like oral prednisone, and we, as part of the test, which we'll get there, you'll see that we're measuring some cortisol metabolites. Those may be elevated. And again, over time, it may alter some of the other parent hormones just based on what it is. It doesn't affect the test as far as making it incorrect, but you may see elevations in some of those cortisol metabolites. Great question. So again, in the urine, remember we're looking at unbound metabolites. It's the receipts, adding up the receipts. We want to see where you're spending your cash, right? Steroidal enzyme activity, to your point. So it's kind of a sticky wicket when you think about it. So your blood filters through your kidneys, waste comes out, it's urine. So in your mind, you think, okay, I'm measuring hormones that are in waste. So what does that really mean? Well, you probably don't think about this, but these are the things we stop and think about to try to really wrap our minds around what's going on. So if your urine level of a hormone is high, what does that even mean? Does that mean all the tissue levels are so saturated that it didn't need it, just dumped in the urine? Possibly. It could be tissue saturation, right? Whatever's not needed gets wasted. But what if those levels are low? What does that mean? Right? So you stop and you think in your head, okay, that's low. Does that mean they have just enough? There's none to waste. Does that mean that there's not enough and they need more hormone levels? That's why it's tricky when you're talking about urine as a way to measure levels of what's going on in tissue, because you don't know that answer. What we do know is that when it's high, we're assuming that the tissue levels are saturated. That's why the blood's dumping it into the urine. Does that make sense? Are you following where I'm trying to go with that? So low levels or moderate levels, you have to really stop and say, that doesn't mean someone needs more hormone. That doesn't mean let's increase their estrogen. Look how low this is, because it might be low because they're using just enough. Yeah? So the reason we think urine hormone testing is important is because of that detoxification in the metabolites. However, it brings up a very interesting topic. And I'm bringing this up not only as it relates to urine hormone testing, but in everything. Whenever any rep comes into your office, not only Rob and Sam or whoever comes to you, I think it's important as clinicians, and it's inherent in who we are. It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. Mark Twain said this. And the point is, you think you know things, but always question, because what you think you know may actually not be so. Don't trust what someone tells you. Don't trust what Rob and Sam say. Always go looking, because they're charming. They're very sweet, and they're absolutely handsome and dashing and charming. But the point is, what people think they know, they might actually not know. And what's even more interesting is, Mark Twain didn't even say that. Josh Billings said that, which is even funnier in the bigger context of the point. So just because someone comes into your office and says, you can absolutely use this to measure this, don't trust them, don't trust me. Go looking and making sure that you're corroborating what's happening. Yeah? The reason I bring it up is this. Can you use urine testing to monitor HRT? Probably the most common question we get in the US. Okay, so very hotly debated topic for that reason. If my urine levels are high, it's a reflection of blood, filtrated blood that's wasted. So again, clinicians assert and say, I can measure my patient's hormones in his urine. Look how high these levels are. And I say, that's great. You're right, because it's a filtrate of blood. But let's focus on what the urine is here. It's waste. So are you assuming that there's tissue saturation and this is all able to be dumped out? You following me? And then when it's low, they say, well, I need to give them more hormones. And I go, whoa. Or are they on just enough? So you have to remember what we're measuring here. Urine is waste. And the reason we think urine testing is important is because of that metabolism part. Now, there are lots of clinicians and lots of labs that absolutely say you absolutely can measure hormones in the urine. They have great, just show me, show me, show me, because there's a lot of different methodologies out there, and there's a lot of different assertions. I would just challenge you to challenge them and yourselves to look this stuff up, because there is no study. This study doesn't exist that compares monitoring topical, oral, any other hormone in all of the matrices to see which is best. I think about it physiologically. This is urine, this is waste, and in my mind this makes sense. Now, some companies have their own internal data, and they absolutely have data that says I can monitor this in the urine, and I say, great, that's your data, but it's not in a peer-reviewed literature. So what Genova does, like I talked about earlier today, is we're profoundly good stewards in the space of functional medicine. And we will only use what we can prove through literature and reproducibility. And so the methodology we use is a 24-hour urine as the standard versus a first morning void, because all of the literature around urinary hormones is done this way. So I challenge you, Mark Twain, Josh Billings, just challenge what I'm saying. Go look it up for yourselves. The beauty of Genova is that we have all of those modalities. We have serum, we have everything, whatever your standard of care, wherever you fall on this continuum, we've got a test for you, kind of by final punctuation to that. However, this is our complete hormones profile. And remember, the 24-hour we use for patients who are on hormone therapy or not. And the first morning void is sufficient for those who don't take any hormones. This is the front page. This is the second page, which is the steroidogenic pathway at a glance page, which we're going to spend a lot of time on. The third page, we do a little bit of synthesis of results for you, some pie charts, which we can talk about. And then at the end of the test, we just sort of outline each of the biomarkers and where they fall within a healthy cohort of patients. Which brings me to this picture. Yeah, this one's a little busy, I'll admit that. But much like the methylation pathway chart we looked at this morning, this is a super important document. And not to overly geek you out, this is laminated on just about everyone's wall at Genova. I don't know where Andrea is, she can attest to that. We live this page, and we like this because this tells you everything you know about how hormones are made and detoxified. And it tells you steps along the way and what affects it. Just gonna stop, and I just wanna spend 1 second here. Here's cholesterol. Cholesterol. You know, before I got into functional medicine, I did all, hospital work. In full transparency, I wasn't putting the connection together between cholesterol and hormones at that time because every patient was on a statin. And so when I came here, I had such profundity to stop and think of all of the disservice I had done to patients for so long. And there's something about cholesterol being at the top of this page that makes me stop and pause and go, cholesterol is important. So cholesterol gets metabolized to progesterone. See all of these pathways along again, these arrows with things that, right, so here's that. So correct, so cholesterol becomes progesterone. Progesterone can come down to make mineralocorticoids. It can also come down to make cortisol. It then comes over to make androgens, DHEA and testosterone. These then come down to make parent estrogens, and then we see the metabolism. That's a lot. There's a lot on this page. But in essence, over time, we've grown to love this paper because it really does show. You start at the top left, it flows over to the right and down. Just putting it there. We're going to refer back to this page as we go through, but just to try to wrap your mind around the concept of cholesterol to progesterone, cortisol, androgens, then down into the estrogens. We'll come back to that, but it's an important page. Let's dumb it down a little, because this is the same information, only not so busy. Okay? Cholesterol, progesterone, can come down to make mineralocorticoids. Can get pulled over to the right to make glucocorticoids, everything in this purple box. What's left then makes DHEA and testosterone, then comes down to the parent estrogens and metabolism. So that page dumbed down. It's on the slides, it should be? Yeah. Yep. So again, same concept, top left, moving to the right and down. This is what our test looks like. Pretty cool, huh? We literally took all of that. And this is what your test result looks like. Up at the top left, we're not measuring cholesterol, but what we are measuring is pregnanediol. Why didn't we measure progesterone? Common question. Progesterone is very rapidly metabolized in your body, and by the time it reaches the urine, not easily detected. But what is easily detected is its metabolite, pregnanediol. A lot of literature showing pregnanediol directly correlates with levels of progesterone. So that's why we use it. So we're measuring pregnanediol, which is a progesterone metabolite. It then moves over here into this big pink box, the glucocorticoids, which we talked about. It has to pass through here to make androgens. What happens, however, is in someone who's under a significant amount of stress, HPA axis dysfunction, pulling a lot of cortisol. Your body is going to need cortisol. It needs cortisol to keep it alive, right? So it's going to pull everything down into this pink box. Cortisol itself is also rapidly metabolized. And in the urine, cortisol and cortisone can go back and forth. You see that there's an enzyme here with reversible arrows. It goes from an active to an inactive form very quickly, depending on the acute needs. You're being chased by a tiger. You're in traffic. You want to punch your boss. Whatever it is. There's a lot that happens in the cortisol to cortisone, active versus an inactive form. The best way, hands down, the way that's all over literature to measure cortisol in any capacity is the saliva. Urine is not your friend when you're looking for how much cortisol do I have on hand. Saliva is all over the literature. It's the way to measure cortisol. If you want to measure someone's HPA axis, you're going to saliva. Now, that being said, we measure the metabolites just to kind of get a feel for balance here. The reason we're measuring metabolites of cortisol is because there's pregnenolone. We have to get from pregnenolone down to estrogen metabolism. I want to know how much are we favoring the catabolic pink box versus the anabolic green box. Catabolic, breakdown, wear and tear. The green box is androgens, growth and repair. So to get from pregnenolone down to where the question we want to answer, there's a pink box and a green box. Clearly, if someone is in that catabolic state, that's important to know. Because cortisol is not very well measured in urine, saliva is the way to go. We at Genova measure all of the metabolites in that pink box because we want to know how much is being catabolized. When you come over to the androgens, these are also rapidly metabolized. DHEA and testosterone are very rapidly metabolized in your body. So for us to get a feel for catabolic and anabolic balance, we total up everything in the pink box and everything in the green box because we want to know which is being favored. If I want to know what someone's cortisol is doing, I'm doing a saliva test. If I want to know what their testosterone is or their DHEA, you're not going to get it really in urine. You're going to get the metabolites of both of those. And we use that to look at anabolic catabolic balance. Does that make sense? And on the second page or the third page of our complete hormones, we actually synthesize this information for you. This is why we're measuring cortisol metabolites. This is why we're measuring DHEA and testosterone metabolites. And what we do here is we total them up from the catabolic, the pink box, the cortisol metabolites. We total up the anabolic metabolites in the green box. We want to get a feel for, is this person more catabolic or anabolic? And there's something called cortisol steal. You may or may not have heard this. There's still debate about whether or not this is actually a thing, but I'm putting it out there. Where in that flow, I guess I'm going to go backwards. In that flow from pregnenolone to get down to estrogen metabolites, a lot can get sucked down into cortisol, right? It's stealing all of that pregnenolone. Instead of making your anabolic and your estrogens, a lot of it's getting pulled down into cortisol. So when we're measuring all of these metabolites, anabolic versus catabolic, this is a place where I would look at this and say, this person's really catabolic. I need a saliva test. You following me? Because like I said, if you're looking at cortisol, saliva is where you want to go. Okay. So with that, we talked about pregnenolone. We talked about the cortisol metabolites. We talked about the anabolic metabolites. This is really the star of the show when it comes to urine hormones. Estrogen metabolism. This is really what we're trying to answer, right? So with that, let me stop here for a second. This purple box, we made them different colors on purpose because when we talk on the phone, it's easier to say, focus on the pink box, focus on the purple box. So the purple box is where we're going to focus. So we start with this purple box. I'm going to point out several things here. E1, that's estrogen, estrone, estrogen 1. Estradiol E2, and estriol E3. These are the parent estrogen hormones. Estrone, E1, is the primary circulating hormone in menopausal female. E2 is the primary circulating hormone in menstruating females. E3 is the primary circulating hormone in pregnant females. Now, that being said, you'll also see there's an arrow that goes both ways there. So in general, we think of estrone as being menopausal, estradiol is cycling, estriol pregnant, but we know that they can all interconvert. Just kind of giving you the basics. The reason we love this box and the reason for this test is this. Estrone, the parent estrogen, has 3 arrows coming off of it. 2-hydroxy, 16-alpha, and 4-hydroxy. We call the left side of this box phase 1 detoxification. So to detoxify estrogen in phase 1, it can go 2, 16, or 4. Phase 2 is the right side of this box where things get methylated. Now, what does all that mean? Use a lot of words. Phase 1, phase 2. What does that mean? There are 2 major pathways of detoxifying your hormones. Phase 1, you have this fat-soluble toxin or a hormone. Phase 1 is that it goes to the liver, to the cytochrome P450 enzymes, and they make it an activated intermediate. So phase 1 is the cytochrome P450 enzymes activated, but it's still activated. It's not ready to be excreted yet. It's still dangerous. What needs to then happen is that it needs to become, sorry, hit the slide too early. It needs to become water soluble to be excreted. And how does that happen? Phase 2. Phase 2 involves conjugation reactions, methylation, glucuronidation, glutathione, right? So there are 2 things we talked about this morning, glutathione and methylation. So when we go to this purple box that we just talked about, you see why this is phase 1. These are cytochrome enzymes. This is phase 2, where they become water soluble to be excreted. We want to know how you're doing this and how well you're doing it. There's phase 1, phase 1, phase 1. These are cytochrome enzymes. And there's three of them. If any of you have gone to IFM training, you've probably heard Philomena Trindade give a lecture similar to this. She uses our complete hormones test to explain this. When you're metabolizing estrogen in phase 1, there are 3 options. She calls this the good, the bad, and the ugly. And that's how I actually explain it and remember it for a good reason. The first one, the 2, probably the least dangerous way to go. To take that pathway, preferable. That's the good. The bad is the 16-alpha. Not as beneficial. There's some risk with various cancers there. But the ugly is this one, to go straight down. Because this 4-hydroxy estrogen is pro-carcinogenic. It becomes oxidized, it develops 3,4-quinones and DNA adducts, responsible for a lot of cancers. So when I look at the purple box on the complete hormones, my head immediately goes, good, bad, ugly. And I immediately say, clearly, I want my patient to take the good route, not the ugly route. So there are ways that you can get people to choose the first pathway. And that big steroidogenic pathway chart that we looked at first has different things on it, different interventions near that pathway, things like cruciferous vegetables, DIM, endocarbinol 3. There are supplements that can push people down the good pathway. If someone has taken the bad pathway or the ugly pathway, you can push them, again, with cruciferous vegetables, DIM, endocarbinol 3. But you also need to give them antioxidants and things to kind of protect them. This all being said, we know this is just phase 1, and there are 2 phases. Phase 2 is where it becomes water soluble and gets excreted. So again, the phase 1 metabolites 2-hydroxy. It's safe, but it still must be excreted. The 16 can stimulate some of the receptors. There's some increase of breast cancer. So again, the key takeaway is good, bad, and the ugly. We'll prefer the good. 16 still has some bad. 4-hydroxy, yuck. And here's why. can create DNA adducts, increasing the risk of breast cancer. Good, the bad, and the ugly. Just a good way to remember it. Thank you, Dr. Trindade. So let's talk about phase 2. Methylation. We're measuring COMT enzymes because methylation is required to detoxify our hormones. We talked about this morning, right? It's a methylation reaction. It's what's needed to get that active intermediate and make it water soluble so you can excrete it. It's phase 2. So we talk about methylation in phase 2 of hormone detox, but we also know that there's a lot of other ways you can detoxify hormones in phase 2. Methylation, glutathione conjugation, amino acids, acetylation, glucuronate. There's other ways you can do it. We focus on methylation and glutathione conjugation, probably just because it's the most popular, but all of these ways are also necessary. But the take-home point around this thus far is that you start with cholesterol and you make progesterone. It comes across and it may or may not get sucked down into the cortisol steel place. We don't want that. We hope it comes over into the androgens, the anabolic place, knowing that DHEA and testosterone are rapidly metabolized. That's why we look at this as a whole. And it needs to come down to the estrogens. So we're looking at the parent estrogens, E1, E2, E3. E1 is the primary circulating hormone in menopausal female. E2, menstruating females. E3, pregnant females, though not always. Additionally, we know that these need to be metabolized, and there's 3 different ways, 3 different pathways estrogen can take: the good, the bad, and the ugly. The 2, the 16, and the 4. We want the 2. The ugly is the 4. It's no bueno. But that also being said, it's only half the picture, because now you have an activated intermediate that needs to now be water soluble. And that's why you need methylation. That's where you need glutathione and some of the things we talked about this morning. So when you have your results of a complete hormone, you have a picture that looks like that purple box here. We usually have the conversation, the good, the bad, and the ugly. We look at that steroidogenic pathways chart to look at the things that can push you down a certain pathway. But then what Genova does is we synthesize it on this page. And to keep it uniform, here's the purple box. We kind of synthesize the purple box for you. Are you favoring the 2 or the 16? Because there are some risks associated. This used to be a bigger thing in the literature, but now it's really that whole concept of 2 is good, 16 is not so good. But regardless, you then got to do phase 2 or it's all for naught. So this is kind of a ratio to tell you which one you're favoring. But it's pretty obvious when you look at the results of your complete hormones, which one's favored. We also look at the methylation activity. We want to see how much of that phase 1 active metabolite got methylated to be excreted. So we synthesize that for you here. Additionally, you'll see this big pie chart. We're going to break it down. We're going to just put it in green, yellow, and red right in your face to see. This is dangerous. 4-hydroxy is ugly. And 16 is in yellow. Green is the way you want to go. But really what the whole concept still to bring it together is the preferred pathway is the 2. And there are specific things you can do to keep it going down that pathway. We have this other 5-alpha reductase activity to kind of speak to the metabolism of testosterone to some of its metabolites. The synthesis page, we spend a little bit of time here, but when you really spend your time in that steroidogenic pathway at a glance page, it's kind of like when we talk about methylation. It all just sort of comes together. Like we can synthesize it on this page, but when you look at that pathway at a glance and you see the result in that place, it sort of just intuitively comes together for you. Now, I'm going to stop here for a second. It's kind of a lot of information. So I'm going to pause here for a second, knowing that we just sort of walked through a lot of different ways to test hormones. That's the question you want to answer, the question you want to ask. Cash on hand, walk into a bank, these are the things. We're going to focus on urine here, but I'll take any question at all based on those things. Yeah. Got it. Yeah. Yeah, it seems counterintuitive. That's a great question. So I'll bring that up, actually. That's a great question. So we're looking at this. Some of this seems counterintuitive. I'll own that. Because it looks like what they're doing is they're taking the 2-hydroxy, and they're dividing it by the methylated forms, and you get this ratio. And it looks like more methylation. It looks like it's on the lower end. It would be bad. So it's not really fully intuitive. But it's really good. We want methylation, which is why sometimes you get kind of hung up in some of this math, which is why we spend most of our time here, because here it's fairly intuitive. She is methylated. She's methylating very well. You'll see it's closer to the more methylation. Yeah, it's counterintuitive in kind of a weird way to represent that all on that. But in my mind, when I look at just that purple box on the actual steroidogenic pathway at a glance page, it's really intuitive because you can see it. This seems counterintuitive because it's really, they put more methylation on the bottom because it's math, but it's really good. Makes sense? Methylation's good. It makes things water soluble so you can excrete them. Yeah? Any other questions on this? Right. In that area. Right.
Thank you.
But again, yeah, excellent, excellent. So she's asking
the
basically
reference range. So looking at,
yes.
So technically speaking, so why is there therefore a reference range? If the person is methylating, then surely that reference range should be shifting more to the left.
Well, it really comes down to look at the math equation. The methyl groups, we want more methyl groups, and so it gives it a bigger denominator, which makes it kind of a smaller number, but that's good. It's not really intuitive when you look at it this way. It's really just math.
Thanks, Mary.
Yeah. Right, right. So the key is you want more methylation. You want more methylation because that's that phase 2. That's what makes it water soluble to be excreted. And again, when I look at this page, it's less confusing to people because you want to see, are they methylating? Are things moving over here? Are we getting it to a methylated place? Good question. She asked, how often do you repeat this test, in essence, after interventions? And so we usually say anywhere from 6 months. 6 months is at least, because it can take some time. Some of the interventions, like if you look at the steroidogenic pathways chart and you have someone that you're trying to force them down the 1A1 pathway and you use something like cruciferous vegetables or DIM or endocarbonyl 3, that can take some time to start to see that shift. But our recommendation is that whenever you have someone on a bioidentical hormone replacement therapy, it's important to really know how they're using these things. What pathways are they taking? So it's one of those things you should really keep a close eye on because you don't want to increase risk for your patient. I probably wouldn't. I would do it somewhat fairly quickly after, yeah. But if you're going to make an intervention to see a change on this, I would say 6 months. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Hi, thank you. In your purple box on the other slide with the,
Correct.
With the
Yep.
big wheel on it,
Yeah.
I understand the 2-hydroxy and the 16-alpha. Is there any reason why you don't have a ratio between the good and the ugly, the 2 and the 4-hydroxy?
Very good
or
question.
16-alpha and the ugly?
There's a great reason for that, and that's an excellent question. I'm going to say 10 years ago, maybe longer, there was a lot of literature around this 2 to 16 ratio. I mean, it was everywhere. This 2 to 16 ratio became something that clinicians use to assess someone's risk of breast cancer. So with that, this 2 to 16 ratio is very common. It's common in literature. It's still spoken and taught about in IFM. And so we keep it on there for that reason. This 2 to 16 ratio is what came out as being a risk factor for breast cancer. However, it now tells half the story, if you can consider, because they're both phase 1. They're both active intermediaries. So it's really just telling half the story. Yeah. Just because you take the 2 pathway doesn't put you out of the woods. You've still got to methylate it and take it into phase 2. We keep it for that reason. In fact, we have a serum test that still is just 2 to 16 for that reason, because there was a lot of literature around this specific ratio and breast cancer. But the good news is on this test, we could then see, are they making that move into phase 2?
Okay, and I have one more, if I may.
Of course.
is in the same box, you've got the methylation activity of the 2-hydroxy.
Yep.
You don't have the activity of the 4-hydroxy, because obviously you methylate that as well. And being the ugly, I probably would like to know what's going on there as well.
Excellent question. The problem is, for the 4-methoxy, is super difficult to measure. And the reason we're doing this methylation activity ratio is we want to see really the activity of that enzyme. And because that 4-methoxy is such a small part of the total metabolites, we can't hang our hat on it to say whether or not you're methylating well or not. Very great intuitive question. Very good. But this can, because this is easy, we can pick this up easily, so we can see how well you're making a conversion. If it were very low, if the 4-methoxy was really, really low, I couldn't hang my hat on it to say you're not methylating well. If it's there, great. Not. You still might be methylating it. I just can't, it's not always picked up. So we use that 2 to 2-methoxy as kind of a gauge. Whenever we see 4-hydroxy at all, that ugly on the test, we talk about methylation support, we talk about glutathione, we talk about antioxidants, because it is so ugly. Go ahead. Sorry. I'll come back to you, I promise.
How could you explain high cholesterol with menopausal women? They don't have any problem until then, and suddenly after menopause, it goes really high. How do you look at that?
I don't. I'm not sure it's related specifically. There's so many other factors that go into high cholesterolemia, and some of it could be unrelated to specifically menopause. I don't know that answer. I don't know that answer. I do know that in general, if someone has such a really low cholesterol, if you're lowering someone's lipids so profoundly low, it's kind of like when women who are so undernourished and underweight stop having periods, stop making hormones. Cholesterol is important for it. The correlation between high cholesterol and menopause, I'm not sure I can make that connection, but I'd be glad to look that up. Yeah.
I just want to ask you, it's from the standpoint of interpretation. So the example we have in the handout shows that the 4-hydroxyestrogen, the ratio is quite low compared to the 2.
Let me go back.
In the handout. Now the one that you have up there shows that the 4, the ratio is much higher. You've got more of the 4 than you have of the 2.
Got it.
So from an interpretation standpoint, does that mean that if we were to look at it at a glance, that we could say that the person is not methylating the 4 in your example, whereas the one in the book shows, in the handout, shows that they're probably methylating quite well? Would that be the right assumption?
The problem is this. So anytime you have anything that goes down to the 4, we get super nervous, right? So we don't want the 4 at all to come down to 4-hydroxy. It's a similar answer to what we just talked about in this regard. To methylate 4-hydroxy will give you 4-methoxy, right? This is somewhat difficult to pick up in laboratory testing in the urine. So if it's low, it's not telling me that you're not methylating. It sometimes is hard to pick up, which is why if we're going to talk about someone's methylation capacity, we're going to depend on the 2 to 2-methoxy, because those are both easily picked up in the urine, which is why we use that ratio to tell you you're pretty good at methylating. If there's a ton of 4-hydroxy but no 4-methoxy, it's not changing what I'm going to tell you. It's telling me, I'm going to look here to see if you're a good methylator or a bad methylator, and if you're a bad methylator, we got to improve your methylation status.
Because it was down the CYP1B1 pathway.
That's right. And we'd like to get you away from that pathway and back up to the 2 pathway. Well, it's not that it's unreliable. If it's there, it's great. We want to know that it's there. If you're methylating, it's great. But the reason that we put it there is because we want to measure all these metabolites. We want to measure what we can. It's difficult to pick up, but we do pick it up, actually. but we don't depend on it and hang our hat on it to say you're a bad methylator. Make sense? Yeah. Not in this specific example, but we're going to go through those genetics. Yeah. Yep. Go ahead, Alex.
How are these optimum ranges affected by stage of life?
By what? I'm sorry.
By the stage of life. Do they change or?
Oh, such a great question. So it comes down to there are specific reference ranges that they have come up. They have a healthy cohort of menopausal female or young females, and they often go by the age of the patient and direct the reference ranges that way. It is affected. And sometimes those patients are supplemented, and so you'll see the reference range will change based on the patient's age and whether or not you mark that they're on bioidentical hormone therapy. I know this is a lot. But this is just really the beginning of this was just to kind of talk to you, number one, about the different ways you can test hormones and understanding that you need to know what question you're going to ask. It's a way to get through how steroids are metabolized, and then in the end, we're looking at those estrogen metabolites because we want to know your risk. So that's what this complete hormone test does. But not only are we answering those questions of which pathway are you taking, the good, the bad, and the ugly, we know there's more to it, which is methylation, again, tying us back to this morning. But there's even a further layer here. And it's similar to what we talked about this morning, this genetic predisposition to having the pathways go the wrong way. Okay? If you guys are going to join me, we can move just a little bit further. Any other questions on those just basic concepts? I know it's a lot. Yeah.
I don't know if this is a stupid question. It's just because I'm a bit confused. So if we see that there's high 4OH, but there's good methylation, then it's not such a worry.
Right.
If we see very little 4OH, but there's very poor methylation, that's the concern. So we're looking more at the methylation than whether or not we're seeing 4OH.
I would say 4OH is ugly. We don't want that ever, 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 ever. If you see it, no, 4-hydroxy, because it can, like I said, can then be turned into DNA.
Even if the methylation is good, we worry
If methylation is good, you have a less of a chance, but it's still not the preferred pathway. So if you're methylating well, I'm like, great, you're methylating well. Let's work on getting you to the right pathway.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you don't want to see any 4OH really, ideally.
You wouldn't. You'd want them to take the 2 or the 16, and then you want them to further methylate. Good question, though. Sam?
We have a question online. Does reference range change if a woman has early menopause?
It might not. It might not. It would put her as compared to other women her age. It's a good question. And if someone has early menopause or for whatever reason, menopause is menopause. But you kind of, when you fill out your rec, sometimes you can say age or whether the person's cycling or on bioidentical hormone therapy. If there is that question, then you can call MedEd and we'll talk it out with them. Right, Andrea?
So I have a client who's on bioidentical hormones, okay? So she's definitely favoring the 4OH, and it's quite high, elevated, menopausal.
Okay.
Okay, so her methylation, if we look at it, is good, a little bit above good.
Good.
So in that case, you're saying we need to move her out, but do we worry that it's like, do we go back to the doctor and tell the doctor basically you need to change something with the bioidentical that you're giving her because there's too much estrogen and testosterone going down the wrong pathway?
We can't tell them that it's too much estrogen. All we can do is decrease the risk if that's going to turn into some type of hormonally related cancer, right? And so there are things you can do to force them down the right pathway without stopping everything, right? Like DIM, cruciferous vegetables. There are other things you can also do to support detoxifying that 4-hydroxy, glutathione, optimizing their methylation. So it's not that you need to stop everything, look what you're doing, you're killing this patient. It's really just, we want to further decrease this risk. We know that it exists now.
Yeah, but the question is to keep an eye on that.
That's right.
And make sure that the doctor is aware of that because they're not trained in reading these.
That's right.
Unfortunate.
That's right.
You know, so just to keep that always every 6 months, double check.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Yeah, that's okay.
Place.
Right.
Sorry. There are a lot of drugs that will affect these pathways, and you've listed some of these in the diagram. How can we know how much they're affecting the pathways and how much?
Such a good point. It's such a good point. And it really comes down to, it's much like with SNPs where there's the potential is there. The way to know is you're looking at the metabolites. You're following how well it comes down at the end. And if you're having a hard time correcting and getting someone down a correct pathway, you start to look at some of those other drugs. You look at some of those other toxic exposures as maybe playing a role here. And so although each step of the way, we're not measuring each analyte throughout that entire pathway, right? We're measuring because we want to see those estrogen metabolites. And so if you're having a hard time optimizing that, you start to go and revisit some of them. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
So I don't know whether you're aware, but some reason they've stopped as an NT advising DIM.
Okay.
Now, I personally had my genes done by DNA Fit.
Okay.
And I always suffered with acne my whole life. And after taking DIM, oh my God, it's just changed my life. And doing one of these as well after I realised that it was all heading down that way.
Yeah.
So how do we, I mean, you know, you're recommending DIM now, but we are not officially allowed to recommend it.
Got it. Well, there are other things. I mean, again, there's just in general, a dietary change, like we talk about, there's very basic dietary changes you can do to kind of keep someone on the straight path. Additionally, supporting methylation is another way, because even if they're taking the wrong pathway, if you can optimize their methylation, you're going to minimize and mitigate that risk. So that's where the methylation panel comes in as well. Okay, let's move on just a little bit. So the beauty of our test, like I said earlier today, is we overlay genetic predispositions with actual biomarkers, because we talked about this morning that your genes aren't your destiny. Not everything is predisposed. Just because you're predisposed to cancer, no one's going to put you on chemotherapy. We want to know, is this actually expressed? And that's an important part of what goes on here. And here's why. We have the 24-hour and the first morning void complete hormones like we talked about. That purple box is also available as a subpanel called the essential estrogens. So if you didn't want the anabolic catabolic balance, you don't want that whole page, you just want that purple box, we also have that as well. But what we also add on are these genetic SNPs, and there are 4 of them. And remember, we talked earlier this morning about we all have millions of SNPs just sitting here in this room. Most of them don't do anything, thankfully. And that Genova picks specific SNPs for a reason. We pick ones that are relevant, that actually make a change in something. We pick ones that are prevalent. We want to know that people actually have them. We want ones that we can modify and override with interventions like lifestyle, dietary, and nutraceuticals. And we want to know that we can measure them. So that's the reason we pick SNPs, and it's the reason we pick some of these SNPs to add on to the urinary hormones. I think I need a new pointer. Did it go up? Thank you. Got it. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So why are we measuring genetic SNPs as it comes to detoxification of hormones? When you look at the SNP and you see what pathway they're taking, you might make a little bit of change here. You might really want to focus on one versus the other. And it's much like we talked about this morning with methylation. Knowing those SNPs can kind of tell you where to focus your efforts and where you don't need to focus your efforts. So it gives you more personalized treatment. We talked about this a little bit earlier. I'm just going to run through this one last time. I'm going to be obnoxious about this. But phase 1 and phase 2. So you have a toxin, the drug, the food, and estrogen. It goes through phase 1, which is the CYP 450, and it makes it into an activated metabolite. that activated metabolite then needs to go through phase 2 in order to become water soluble to be safely eliminated. There are a lot of things along that pathway that can alter these things, like oxidative stressors, toxins, but that's the basic flow of things. Something you want to get rid of, phase 1, still activated, and then you got to make it water soluble in phase 2 to get rid of it. So we talked about this in this purple box. These are the phase 1 CYP enzymes. Okay? We talked about phase 2, and here we look at methylation, but we know that there are other ways to detoxify in phase 2. So let's talk about this just for a second, because I think this is another really interesting way to explain this. Phase 1 is taking out the trash. So you got these little kids carrying the trash to the curb. Phase 2, when the garbage truck comes, it takes it away. Yeah? Doesn't that make sense? So now, what if phase 1 is upregulated? What if you have a SNP in those enzymes? What if there's a problem with one of those SNPs? It becomes upregulated. You got a lot more trash ending up on the corner. What if phase 2, the enzyme is downregulated and the garbage truck goes really slow? You get a lot of trash hanging out. So when we're talking about SNPs in these phase 1 and phase 2 enzymes, it's important to think about it that way. Phase 1, you're taking it to the curb. Phase 2, the garbage truck is taking it away. If you have a SNP in any of those phase 1 enzymes, you're just dumping more and more trash. If you have a SNP in phase 2, the garbage truck is taking its sweet old time getting rid of it. So either way, you're left with a ton of trash. Make sense? Because that's what happens here. The SNPs that we're measuring for a reason. This 1B1 pathway, when there's a SNP in it, it upregulates. So it's just to start dumping things down into 4-hydroxy, which is bad. The patient that you described may have a SNP in 1B1. The other thing that's important is that if there's a SNP in the phase 2 enzyme, COMT, as it relates to estrogen detoxification, that slows down. Imagine that. Imagine having a SNP in phase 1 and a SNP in phase 2. That's just a recipe for badness. But it's important to know how aggressive you're going to be here. Make sense? So let's look at that first SNP that we're talking about here. Here it is. We just talked about it. We know that this is the good, the bad, and the ugly. This is the ugly. So if you have a SNP, you swab your cheek with the complete hormones, and your result looks like this. Look how high that 4-hydroxy is. We're already thinking that's bad. We're going to do some dietary changes. We're going to support methylation. But if I know you have a SNP here and this is happening, I might actually be really reconsidering that hormone replacement therapy. I might really be reconsidering how aggressive I'm getting as far as antioxidant support and really pushing this a different way. Because, again, it increases that 4-hydroxyestrogen, which we know can then be oxidized to make quinones, 3,4-quinones, which are then making DNA adducts, which then make cancer. So having a CP450-1B1 SNP increases that activity, has an increased risk of breast cancer, higher BMI. It has all of these associations with it. And in someone like this is where I'd really start rethinking some of that replacement therapy, to your point. So when you order the SNPs in conjunction with the complete hormones, you get a page that looks like this. We talked a little bit about this morning when we were doing methylation SNPs. We give you a ridiculous amount of information just because it's important. So, and your genes don't change. Check this once. And what we want to know is the location of the chromosome, the genotype, the phenotype. And if you think about it, there are 2 alleles. You get one from your mom, one from your dad, right? So just having one can increase this a little bit. Having 2 really increases it, much like we were talking about the SNPs this morning. Having 1, it's there. 2, really there, except when we talk about MTHFR a little bit. But here, this is really throwing things down that ugly pathway. So to have a SNP here, you really want to know that this exists. And on the test, we give you some of the health implications of having this particular SNP just in and of itself. And then we also give you some management considerations, some things that you can do to minimize having that SNP, because it comes back to that whole concept of we want to pick a SNP that we can do something about, and we know that is important. So these 4-hydroxyestrogens, which we talked about, are very potent. They need to be methylated. They make these DNA addicts. They're associated with all of these bad things. Interestingly enough, not only do we have breast cancers associated with 4-hydroxy, but there's a link between this particular SNP and prostate cancer, right? So this is important. So this isn't only females. There's a lot of links associated with men. So to add SNP testing to complete hormone testing and knowing what you're dealing with when you give your patients bioidentical hormone therapy is important. You want to know what the risks are. Again, doesn't always manifest, but you need to have some education around it and make a smart choice. So let's look at phase 2. COMT, right? We talked about COMT this morning in the methylation talk, and we talked about how a SNP can slow it down. We talked about how COMT is responsible for breaking down neurotransmitters, but it also is responsible for making hormones water soluble to be excreted. So again, it came down to that concept we just talked about earlier. If you have a SNP in phase 1, it makes it faster. If you have a SNP in phase 2, it slows it down. So you're really adding up the trash at the curb. That's not good. So you really want to know if you have this SNP for many reasons, not only because of hormones, but because of neurotransmitters. The role of methylation, again, it's making things water soluble to be excreted. Methylation defects, we talked about epigenetics, it makes DNA. We talked about methylation this morning, and here's where it really comes into fruition, specifically as it relates to hormone detoxification. So 4-hydroxy is less likely to oxidize to carcinogenic compounds if neutralized by COMT. If you're able to methylate, if your methylation capacity is good, it decreases the ability of this to be carcinogenic, but it's still there. You still need things like antioxidants, glutathione support, and really pushing a different pathway. The ratios in the urine provide a gauge of your methylation capacity, which we talked about a little bit. And it's really because the 2-methoxy is a lot more readily readable in the urine, so it gives you a better gauge. But if we look at the COMT as it relates to risks and estrogen metabolism, we know it deactivates catechol compounds. We know that it decreases the COMT activity. But what we just talked about here was low activity of COMT with high CYP1B1. That's just a recipe for disaster. Look at all that trash sitting at the curb. 6-fold higher risk for ovarian cancer. A lower activity of COMT has a greater risk for breast cancer, and it's because of that whole concept. Methylation is important to make things water soluble to be excreted. So knowing your genetic predisposition could be important here. MTHFR. I know we beat this one into the ground this morning, but again, this is also an add-on to the urinary hormones for this reason, because it's tying in the genetic SNPs, it's tying in hormone detoxification to what we talked about this morning, which is methylation, which is so important. And we know that MTHFR is the step that commits folate to the methylation cycle to keep that methylation cycle rolling. We talked about this morning, that there's 677C and that there's 1298A. Again, we're going to give you your specific genotype, one from your mom, one from your dad. We're going to give you the health implications and some treatment options. But MTHFR is a little bit different, like we discussed this morning. We know that we measure the 2 of these because if someone has merely just 1298, if you look up here at the top right, if they have just one little copy of 1298, nothing happens. If they have 2, it decreases this activity. Anything, any 677T will change activity. So this is an interesting slide in that concept because it also relates to what we talked about this morning, methylation. the next one we're measuring as part of the complete hormones is vitamin D receptor. Vitamin D receptor hormone bone formation. So again, this is a specific SNP because we're looking at VDR because it's a receptor that binds the active form of vitamin D and interacts with the target nuclei to produce effects. So it impairs your ability of vitamin D to work and protect your bones. This is super important. Again, the clinical management considerations are here as well. I'm repeating the same thing there. So because we know how important vitamin D is, polymorphisms can affect a lot of different things, not only osteopenia, metabolic syndrome. There's a lot of really interesting research around vitamin D and cancer. Vitamin D has a lot of immunomodulatory important effects as well. So we don't always focus merely on osteoporosis and osteopenia. There are other things that are very important that may be impacted by having a SNP. So again, it comes back to that whole concept of genetic predisposition is what it is. When you measure it with actual biomarkers, you can get a feel for what's expressed. When you think about doing urine hormone testing, we went through the entire pathway. We went through the whole concept of metabolism, but even as part of that metabolism, estrogen metabolism, knowing your genetic predisposition can help you target things and take things a little bit more seriously to the effect, like we just spoke about, maybe rethinking specific therapies. This is what the requisition looks like, and this is where you would add on some of those genomic add-ons to the complete hormones. That also being said, we covered a ridiculous amount of information here. So I'm going to open this up to questions as it may relate to any of that we just talked about. Yeah. I love it. That's why we're here. We left lots of time for questions, which is great.
Obviously, you're going down the 1B1 route to 4-hydroxy, and I understand why you're not going to test the 101 because if you've got a SNP on that, that's great. Mm-hmm. But what's your reasoning for not doing 3A4? Because that's obviously not good, but it's on the bad.
Yeah, I mean, again, it comes back to the whole concept of when the genetic SNPs were developed, the decisions that were made. There's always room to add and upgrade all of these profiles. We have other Genovation line testing that measures different SNPs. It's great feedback and something we'll add. You know, I know they're constantly reevaluating which SNPs we add. They picked the one that was kind of the most impactful, but that doesn't mean that literature hasn't evolved to include that. So just so that you know, every time you speak to a rep, every time you speak to Andrea or Kate or Sam or Rob or Oliver, and you give them a feedback like that, all of this gets put in a place so that when we're developing new products, we say, you know, 35 people at this conference asked for this. We need to really focus here. So any feedback is great. Always speak to your rep and give us your feedback. So yes, I agree with you.
And I promise this is the last question.
You don't have to promise that. That's why we're here.
Obviously, genetics are a big thing in relation to, you know, getting other people's genetics and all that sort of stuff. What is your process from actually taking the sample to actually getting the result and the result back to you guys? Do you anomalize? Where does the stuff go? Does it go out of the country, as in our samples? Where does our data go? It may not be appropriate for now, but it's just a question that I always get asked.
That's a good question. So you swab your cheek, right? It gets sent and you draw your blood or give the urine. It goes to Genova, UK, and they ship it to Genova, US. The interesting thing is we're not shotgun sequencing all of your DNA. In fact, we have very specific primers. We go looking for these specific things. You could have a lot of other things wrong in your DNA. We're not even looking. We just look for these specific SNPs. It is against federal law where we live for this to go anywhere other than profoundly protected for your information. It's not part of any database. It's not part of 23andMe. It's profoundly protected by federal law. Genova will be shut down if it went anywhere else, which we don't want to do. But it kind of works that way in the sense that it's not part of anything national. It gets associated with you and you only, and then discarded. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question? It's in the United States. It differs. It differs. I don't know if Oliver, if you can speak to some of that.
The swabs with the saliva on for the DNA testing are not frozen. They are shipped at an ambient temperature. Depending on what it is, we know the guys in the US have done so many studies on how long each thing will last. So we get everything in the UK, in New Malden, Southwest London. We will stabilise it appropriately and get it to the US. If we feel that the stability has been compromised, we will not run your tests. And anyone that's done testing with us before has probably received what we call a STAR notification to say we're not running this test for stability reasons. So we're always very cautious around that.
It's a great question, though. We get it a lot. No? Yeah.
As not having many of them, then is there anything that you can do about it?
There are. I mean, even if you look at this particular page, hang on, let me go back. There are specific things on here. So you can eventually, as Rich says, benefit from vitamin D supplementation, calcium intake, vitamin K. You know, there's specific formulations. There's D3K2, which, you know, having the two specific parts of those vitamins help with bone formation. So there's certain things you can do. If you'll see here, caffeine intake greater than 300 milligrams a day can accelerate bone loss. So it really comes down to some of those things you can do to try to counteract it. And just because you have a SNP doesn't mean that it's going to be specifically expressed. But D3K2 is something that is used a lot. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're shooting for a higher level. You may just change, like, for example, you may change your formulation and give them D3K2 because that will actually take the vitamin D and they will help the receptor work better. And certain things like decreasing caffeine, there are other things you can do to kind of help countermand that. Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
You don't do the add-ons when you just do the estrogen metabolites, is that right? We can't request the estrogen metabolite test and then do the genetic add-ons. You only get the add-ons with the complete hormone, is that right?
I think it's both. I'm not sure about that. Oliver? Yeah?
It's both. Oh, that's good.
Yeah, it's just a smaller panel, just that purple box, yeah.
Yes, both. Then no. Yes. Correct. They're only running those. Yeah.
Sorry about that. We're a little early. Go ahead.
Hiya. The graph you've got there for the MTHFR, and
Right.
you've got it down into, you know, this SNP is 30% reduced activity. Da, da, da. Is that the only SNP that you've got that level of detail for?
Actually, as far as the complete hormones,
Yeah.
yeah, it is. And if you go to the methylation SNPs, we have a ridiculous amount of information there. We break it down further into population studies, but the MTHFR kind of and COMT bridge both of those. There may be more information on that paper in the methylation report. As far as VDR and CYP, those are the only, we don't go into that granularity. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, it's just not part of the report. It might be something to PubMed. And like we spoke a little bit earlier, it really comes down, the information on those SNP pages is so important, not only because things aren't always expressed, but that population concept. The amount of transparency on that SNP page is there for a very specific reason. And even some of the IFM teachers, like Deanna Minnick, will often, she just praises it because it's so transparent, because people hang their hat on SNPs so profoundly. And you really can't, because not only does it differ on your ethnicity, your population, whether or not it's expressed. So we've come to a place, the genetic SNPs for the urinary hormones are a little bit older. We've come to this place with the methylation report that is profoundly transparent and detailed for that reason. We're trying to move that way. Yeah. So there may be more information available on the methylation reports. Hemina.
Thanks, Patty. As always, really fascinating. Just with regards to the genetic testing, some of the work that I do is of a medical legal aspect. Have you had examples where the patients have had to declare that they've had certain genetic testing, especially for life insurance purposes and or equivalent? Just wondering if you've had any examples.
Such a good question. No. And in fact, in my thinking, I don't believe that that would ever come to a specific legal or a law, especially even in the United States, for that reason, because much like we've been saying, just because you have a genetic predisposition doesn't mean that you're going to ever express that. So it would be like, I can't get health insurance because my mom had breast cancer. They wouldn't do that, right? So it kind of comes down to, just because you've had genetic testing, it's not a law that you need to tell your insurance carrier that you carry it. Yeah, excellent question though. And one that, especially with all this 23andMe and all this DNA out there that is starting to really become an issue, you're right. You're right. Right.
You mentioned a few times today that just because you have the gene, it's not expressed, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when we look at the COMS and all these important, CYP, those must be expressed surely in your everyday thing.
Well, the issue really becomes, even when we talk about methylation a little bit, like you have SNPs all over these pathways, you have SNPs all over this urinary estrogen metabolism. There are ways that your body will adapt to make its way around them. Like even with methylation, some people have MTHFR and have perfect methylation. It's not someone I would just give them methylated folate for. It really comes down to that concept of, you want to see, is your body adapting and finding another way? Is this even being expressed? They're not all expressed, like I said. And so the fact that each of us have millions of SNPs sitting here at the table is kind of
basically looking at the whole picture.
Yeah, that's 1,000% right. And every patient's different, right? Yeah, such a good point.
So, sorry, just very specific question about one of my clients. So she actually has breast cancer in the family from both sides.
Okay.
And her CYP1B1 is super fast.
Wow.
And I just looked at the COMT, is double yellow. That's medium, or is it slightly reduced activity?
Is it, what does it say under dash dash? Do you have a...
Well, we have a different system, so red, yellow, and green. So it's yellow and yellow.
So it
two
might
of
be
them.
that it's, yeah, like one copy, one allele.
What other phase 2 enzymes should I look at?
Great question. The other ways that you can phase 2 detox are things like glucuronidation. So in someone like that, you might think about the GI effects, and here's why. On the GI effects, there's a marker called beta-glucuronidase. Yes. So when you phase 2 detoxify a hormone, it goes to the liver. The liver throws a glucuronide molecule on it. That's glucuronidation to make it water soluble to be excreted into your stool. On the GI effects, we measure beta-glucuronidase because that's an enzyme that undoes that step and sends that estrogen back into circulation. So oftentimes, if you have someone like this, you do a stool test because you want to know, are we recirculating estrogens? Is that glucuronide being undone? Other things you can think about, there's a detoxogenomics profile that we have that looks at ways glutathione deconjugates and transfers. So you'd measure their glutathione, you'd support them with antioxidants, you'd think about beta-glucuronidase. These are some other phase 2 things that you can really think about for that person. Is that right? Interesting. I mean, this is really interesting. You can support with glutathione and other antioxidants. Yeah, I would really work on pushing that. Yeah. Right, Kate? Or Andrea? Yeah. It's a good case, though. Yeah.
Sorry, it's me again.
Yay. Oh, yay.
This morning we looked at methylation, and I'm sort of curious as to why you haven't included the urea cycle in relation to inflammation and glutathione production and nitric oxide and all that wonderful stuff.
You know, you should really hang out with Michael Chapman. You guys would be fast friends because he lives in that world of all of these things interact. The methylation cycle, transsulfuration, the Krebs cycle, the urea cycle that feeds. If you walk into our offices in Asheville, there's an entire wall of how they all interact. And so the dream, the nightmare, if you will, for Michael is to put all of these as separate pathway tests that will eventually interact like a jigsaw puzzle. So methylation is the first kind of iteration away from these big nutri-valves into trying to fit these pathways all into one. But he would love you for asking that question. Yep. Yeah. Yeah?
Before you put any of these tests in the market, how do you do the testing? How do you do trials in terms of patients, or do you do any research in terms of that? Or?
Yeah, and I can speak to that only because we've been through this just with the methylation panel. We haven't had a brand spanking new panel in a while. The methylation is kind of the first that came from nothing.
Mm-hmm.
So it comes down to we research the biochemistry and see what we want to measure. Then we think about what do we care? Is this really important? So that's years of research, literature, and putting together documents as to why this is important. Then we do lit dyes to look for outcome studies that say if we treat some of these abnormalities, do patients get better? We want to know what we do matters, right? So there's an entire development process there. Then it comes down to someone like Michael putting together a panel and going to the head of our lab and saying, these are the things I want to measure, how do we do it? That's a whole other development of trying to figure out the best way and the most reliable and valid way to measure these, which is a whole other development, research and development part. They then take an entire group of people. They'll find by questionnaire qualification a healthy cohort or whatever population they want. So, you know, healthy cohort means different things to different people, but there are exclusionary criteria. So they'll take 500 people. They'll go to an IFM conference. We'll get 500 people to fill out surveys. We qualify them. We put them into buckets and say, yes, no, rejected. We're trying to find a healthy cohort. We try to get rid of specific supplements or medications that could interfere with the assay. It's a very long process. Then we get a list of these people and we get their results. And then it comes down to you need to get as many as you can to be statistically significant, right? And so then you test all of these people and you come up with a reference range. But then you go back and you test some of these others that didn't make the cut because we want to see if can this test tell healthy from unhealthy? And that's kind of the process by which it goes. With that, we did that with methylation. We do that for most of our, all of our tests undergo the same very long process of putting together a reference range and healthy cohort and making sure it can distinguish healthy from unhealthy. The other arm of medical affairs is our clinical evidence department. And we have an MD PhD who runs that, Dr. Li Hong Chen, who takes patient surveys. Oftentimes there are surveys in your kit and a patient can opt to take the survey or not and just answer questions about their general well-being. I take this medicine, I feel this. And so if you can consider that Genova gets hundreds of thousands of tests, this is a significant amount of data.
Yeah, exactly. Is this data available?
We can't use anyone's data without their permission. So a patient has to agree to fill out the survey and agree to have their stuff analyzed. And it always remains double-blinded. Nobody knows whose results are what. But what Dr. Chen does is we use this information to not only update and make our tests better, to give an extra layer of clinical utility that clinical associations we didn't think of. Most specifically, I'll talk about the GI effects. Several 100,000 GI effects have come in. He can make a pattern of bacteria that are healthy versus not healthy, which then becomes a graphic on the front page of the GI effects report based on hundreds of thousands of data. So you can see where your patient falls in relation to hundreds of thousands of people who have done this test. So we take all that data to not only make the test better and upgrade it and give another layer of clinical utility, but the other thing he does is he publishes papers. Yeah. So he's developing different biomarkers. He's developing different patterns. That's the hope with the methylation panel, is that we can add to the kind of the places where there's holes in the literature, where none of this stuff has really been written about. We talk about it, but when patients are telling us, I'm anxious, I'm taking all this methylation, and we have all of these results, and patients who are saying we can use their data, we're going to put it out there to move this all forward. So yeah, it's super fun. Thank you. Hi. Yeah, here comes Rob.
I have just a quick question. So this test, the complete hormones, doesn't come with SNPs.
It does not. It's an add-on, correct?
Okay.
Yes.
So every SNP, we have to pay extra for it, or is it a full?
They can answer this a little bit better for me. Rob, Oliver, is it a la carte SNPs, or does it come as one package? Do we know that answer?
No. So no. So here it's like when we're doing this, then we were discussing all the SNPs that come along with it. So if we wanted to, because the question is, how do we know which one to choose? So the idea is, okay, we'll run the SNP and the Dutch in order to figure out, like what I was talking about, the client who has the 40H. And then you went and said, well, if she has the SNP in both, then basically she shouldn't be on the bioidentical, right?
Or you would rethink it. You would
exactly, yeah. So then the question is, well, how do I know which SNP, when we're looking at to order the SNP, I wouldn't have known beforehand. So I'm just trying to understand the easy way of, do we run the whole? Is it one package, or is it each one is an additional? And then how will I know which one to choose?
Well, when they created the SNPs to be add-on to the urine hormones, they did it for a reason. So everything on there is on there for a reason. And you'll see where that actually fits into that metabolism pathway. So that's one way you can say, where does it fit? There's a whole line of Genovations testing, of just genetic testing. If you go to the Genova website, you might be able to take a look at. But as far as if you have urinary hormones, can you pick and choose, is the question I don't know the answer to. If it comes as you need to take all 4 with the complete hormones test, or if you can only do 1 or 2. Oliver?
So you can pick and choose, is the truth. So the reason why we've done it that way is actually some of them, in fact 2 of them mirror 2 of the SNPs that are available on the NutriVal test. So if people have already run that test, they have the results already, because we said they don't change. So we don't want to automatically charge people for everything when everything may not be necessary. So it then comes back to what you have historically and what you need going forwards.
Yeah. We're done a little bit early. Yeah. Yeah.
One more.
You're so funny.
I don't know about anybody else, but I've literally just opened my package, and there are so many tubes and swabs and
For
whatever.
For which?
For the methylation panel. Does anybody have like 10 minutes to walk me through it? Because I've done many tests and that's really confusing me.
Yes, we got you.
I don't know if it would be suitable for everybody else in the room, because there's like 5 tubes and it's like, sorry.
Here comes Oliver.
But you might get stuff back that's just not usable, that's all.
I think she pulled hers open already.
Yes.
Yeah, Oliver, you want to use Minna's?
Okay.
You can use Minna's. No?
So, thanks for this one, by the way. I'm going to stand at the front of this table. So, in each of these packs, you'll find a single bag. Now, is method to the madness, so bear with us. The instructions look complicated because there's a lot of information, but at the same time, it's actually relatively straightforward. So, you have 3 tubes. Magically, one of them disappears. So you have two lavender tops. One's a 4 ml, one's a 6 ml. Now, if anybody that's done a NutriVal test before, the 6 ml tube will be centrifuged within 15 minutes of its blood draw. Essential for homocysteine to start with, but also we need the plasma separated and put into a freezer within about 45 minutes, or kept cold at least, because the salmon and the sal, which are apparently relatively integral to this test, are very sensitive little creatures. So the ideal scenario is you take blood draw, you take the 6 ml tube, you spin it within 10 minutes, 15 top end, and you separate the plasma as soon as possible. That goes into this secondary little tube. That's the clear one with a little white top. It's just a transfer tube. There's nothing special about it. That can then go in the fridge. We do provide a gel pack with this kit as well, which is the splodgy white thing you'll see. Technical terms from me. Splodgy white thing. The instructions do ask a patient, if they're going to an outside clinic to be drawn, to take this with them frozen. That means they can then place the plasma that they've had separated pretty sharply straight into a bag containing this to cool it straight away. We then prefer them to take it home in an ideal world and freeze it overnight and then ship it to us the following day. That gives us the best chance of receiving it cold. It has a lifespan of about 24 hours if cold. But if we receive it at room temperature, because the salmon and the sal will die within about 45 minutes of it being room temperature, we will run the rest of the sample, but you will not get a salmon sal, which you probably want, and then in which case we'll need a repeat sample. So it looks like there's a lot in there, but actually half it goes missing. No, we never charge people for resubmitting samples, ever. So they might have to pay to post it to us again. That's the worst thing. But if somebody needs a repeat kit, this goes for any of our tests, not just these ones. So if somebody does something wrong with the collection of a sample, comes back to what I mentioned earlier. If we're unhappy with the sample, what we don't do is run it and go, you'll make the best of those results. That just goes against everything we're about. So we would rather actually reject a sample, ask you to redraw it to be sure you're getting the right results. We will post out a kit, our charge, and then they just have to do what they do and bring it back to us. So it's just important people to get it right. So I'll go through it again. The big one, centrifuged, plasma separated into the tube. That is the pipette, which anybody can use to remove plasma. Yeah, the patient obviously won't do it because they can't draw their own blood or centrifuge it usually. Ever tried to draw your own blood? That's got to be hard. The smaller 4 ml tube just needs to come back in the packet. That is nice and stable, so that will just be fine. So the recommendation is just get it back to us cold as soon as possible. See, it's not that bad. Oh, yeah, the genetic test did this. So the envelopes are here. So the requisition form you'll see, the one that you've all received, will automatically have the methylation genomics add-on ticked for you, because that's just part of what we're arranging for you. So the swab is taken as any would, take it out, rub it round, there's 2 in there, so 1 round each cheek, let it dry 10 minutes or so, and then place it back into its inner, and then place that in this envelope. Send it back to us. Oh, do I have to? Oh, sorry, I took that as granted. Okay, remind the patient to do the inside of the cheek, not the outside of the cheek. As I say, I took that as standard. Does that help? Is there any more questions to put that together? Go on, shout it out. Yeah. Yes. So the nearest company that does phlebotomy on our behalf is about a 7 or 8 minute walk away, or about a 2 minute drive. If you had it drawn there and it was uncentrifuged, you can bring it straight to us, or the patient can say it's a methylation panel, get it in the centrifuge, we'll do that instantly. You have to book the blood draw with the site, but you can just turn up to us. And as long as it says this is within 15 minutes, we can see the draw time and we see what time we received it, we'll do the rest. On a Saturday and Sunday, that's right. Okay, so the question is, if you run SNPs on a different test, can we take that into account when interpreting the blood and plasma portion of this test? Yes, but I would suggest the likelihood this test does 10 individual ones. The most likely is you're going to have 4 at the most. If you have them from another lab, I guess because we haven't done it, that makes life more difficult. But we'll always try and help you out. You know, the discussions you have with people like Andrea and our clinical team, if you said, yes, someone has this predisposition and SNP, I'm sure we can work with that.
The other thing, if I may, is that when you look at the methylation panel on each SNP page, we have the specific RS number and the primer number of the SNP we're measuring. Some labs measure different sections of the same gene, which would be a whole different interpretation. So you might want to check to see if they're measuring the exact same SNP we're measuring based on the primer and the RS number, just to throw that out there, because there's a lot of different SNPs for these enzymes. They mean different things based on the RS number.
Me turning the mic off again. So the question at the front here was, if somebody lived in a different part of the country, what do we do about the stability of the sample? So our courier services that we employ usually can bring things to us within 24 hours. So a patient can have it either at home or at work. They will collect one afternoon and deliver it to us the next morning. So they do that. So that's the reason why, if you're further away, my recommendation and what's in the kit instructions is that people take the plasma home with the gel brick, so it's already getting cold, and put it in the freezer overnight. So the two get frozen overnight effectively. That means when the courier come around the next afternoon and take it out, the gel pack and the silver bag that's with them are enough to usually keep it cold to get to us. That's why if it turns up warm, or we think this has been in transit for 2 days, sometimes we'll check. People may have had different staff from us in the past, or we'll say, can you verify if this sample has been frozen and when it was shipped to us? So we'll go back to the patient and ask that by yourselves. And if it's within our stability window, we can then accept it. And this is no different. The other thing is, if you have patients that are based in London, there's obviously a couple of clinics through our website that Rob and other people have organised that will do the centrifuging and will freeze these samples for you. They're kind of based in the West One area. So we've got a couple in Harley Street, one in Upper Wimpole Street. So they are places you can send your patients to who will know what they're doing with this test. And then we have a bike that will collect from them to bring it to us within an hour or so. Does that help? Yeah, that's what it's. The other side is people can use the postal service because of the quantity of the sample. They can actually just take it in its box, sealed, to the post office and say, deliver that on a pre-10 tomorrow, or at least the next day delivery to us. Our post comes at 9:30 in the morning. We'll check it. If it's methylation, we'll deal with it straight away. Any other practical kind of questions? That's all I'm useful for. Okay, so the question was regarding the blood draw site near where we are in Newborn. It's Groves Medical Centre. If anybody's ever looking for somewhere, our website, if you click under where it says clinician, in fact, or patient at the top, there is a phlebotomy drop down, and then anybody can then figure out through the postcodes they're on there. They're all listed in the first 1 or 2 letters of the postcode, so people can just go in there, see what's local. But Groves is our nearest one that they can use, if that is convenient for your patients. Anybody else? Never normally allowed to talk this long, so. Wonderful stuff. Then I believe we have coffee. I know we're a bit early, so we're probably going to be 15 minutes early. So if we say come back for about 3 o'clock or so, and we'll just start the SIBO talk a little bit early. Does that work? Good times.